this Data for the People series, we asked, what does it mean to be social from different angles of biology? It was really cool to hear from all of our presenters, Taylor, Sophia, Chad, and Lindsay, and a couple of the things that they talked about in such amazing ways. I learned so much. They have such awesome educational approaches to these things. We started off looking at ants, where Lindsay talked about what happens when an individual in an ant colony gets sick, and do they ditch their person that's or their person sorry I'm anthropomorphizing. This is the thing that we do not want to be doing when we're talking about social behavior with our organisms. But do you get rid of the ant that's sick, or do you do something to help the colony and sort of care do some caretaking? So that was super cool research that was described. Taylor continued in the ant system, where she explained how we had clonal raider ants and army ants, and thinking about the science of, or the sort of the evolutionary factors that might impact the size of the raids when the ants go to find food. So that was super cool. Then we had Chad talking about flies, using flies as a system to think about learning, and how some flies were able to teach other flies about predatory threats in the form of wasps. So flies, even though they're not necessarily a social organism, showcase some social behavior, which is really cool. Similarly, worms, which are not a social organism, also displayed some really interesting social behavior. And Sophia took us through that when we looked at how worms were coordinating their swarming behavior using really cool hypothetical modeling to check that out. So this is sort of a summary of all of the things that we talked about. And now what we want to do is just have a conversation and hear from you about what your questions are about how this might all relate to each other, and relate to biology, and how it can inform our understanding of social life. So if you start thinking about your questions, again, drop them into the chat, or feel free to raise your hand if you want to contribute, turn your video on. This is, again, an informal situation, and we hope to just have fun talking about social behavior. All right. So, by the way, my name is Jeannie Garbarino, and I'm the director of Rocky Deep Science Outreach. I forgot, even though I'm not really that important in this conversation. So I'm going to be talking to people who know a lot of awesome stuff. So let's focus on them. All right, I'll kick it off by asking, one of the big takeaways for me when I was learning about all of this from, the papers that you are all describing, is that communication takes place in so many different ways. What are the factors? So just to go back, the communication, what we thought about was like, the chemical communication with potential pheromones. We saw that in some of the ant stuff. We saw Chad described this really cool experimental setup where flies use their vision to learn from each other. And Sophia, I'm not sure I understood exactly what the communication cue was for the worms, but they certainly were communicating with each other in some fashion, right? So what are the factors that influence how a specific species might choose a primary mode of communication? And I'm just going to spotlight everybody so that we can see you a little better. I don't know who wants to start, but go for it.
Maybe I'll start off with just a few thoughts on that. Hi, everyone. I'm Taylor. I'm a grad student at Rockefeller, as are all of the panelists today. But so I'd say one important factor is, what are the important sense modalities for the organism? So we have, the basic senses of vision, hearing, touch, taste, and smell. And most animals also have similar things. But if you look at the clonal raider ant, which is the organism I study, they actually live underground and they don't have eyes. So they're obviously not going to use vision to communicate anything to each other. And they actually use mostly chemicals to communicate, we think. And so the types of sense modalities that are important for organisms can provide some basis for like where can communication come from. But it's also maybe it depends on the type of communication that you want to do. Like, so one difference might be that if you're communicating through sound, sound doesn't last. Like we can talk to each other, but the sound dissipates really quickly. So you can only talk to someone when they're nearby you. But if you want to leave a message in the ground, like in a particular spot, like for example, if you're an ant and you found a piece of food and you want to mark a trail that leads from the nest to the food, you couldn't do that with sound really. Instead, they use chemicals. So that's one place where chemical communication has an advantage because you can leave it in a spot and it will remain there for some amount of time. So there's a lot of different factors that can affect like what type of communication might be favored. I don't know if anyone else has other thoughts.
I agree with what you're saying, and I guess to add to it, I wonder like about the sort of the evolution of sort of this sort of communication. Let's take the example of cats. Like they communicate with humans by, you know, meowing and so, but that's something that's reserved and have been adapted to for humans, not between themselves. So it's also very interesting how, like, you know, you could have communication, but it's also not limited between species. You could have communication between different species. Like, you know, your dog would bark at you when it's hungry and it wants treats. You know, it's communicating with you. Your cat would like, you know, come and cuddle and meow and purr. Like, I don't know, like the various, I guess, you know, we have cat people and dog people, they would know. But yeah, I think that's like also like a very interesting part of the communication, sort of the environment that allows for this sort of evolution, the need to communicate in different ways the most effectively.
Yeah, I think, you know, Chad, you raised something really interesting around interspecies communication. And maybe this is a good segue because, you know, my kids are, I have, all right, this is a little embarrassing, but I'm like a little bit of an animal lover and a bit of a sucker. And I have accumulated 4 dogs and 4 cats because they're all rescues. And I'm, like I said, I'm a very big sucker. But often like my children will be like, Mom, is the dog giving me a hug? Are they giving me love? And they always roll their eyes because I'm saying, well, you know, we can't really think about the emotions in animals the way we think about emotions in people, right? And I just would love to sort of go into this a little bit and think about like, what are the limitations of studying social behavior in animals, and how do you keep yourself sort of more objective and not, you know, helping people not look at it through this purely human lens?
I must say, like it's challenging. Even with me with flies, it's challenging not to like think of sort of like anthropomorphizing like the flies as they, because I do olfactory experiments, and olfaction isn't something that, you know, is not familiar, you know, because we smell things. I love to cook, so I love to smell things too. So I would imagine like, you know, if a fly is hungry, like, you know, it trying to like find food. I imagine myself trying to find food, like, you know, like what would I do? What is the
Mhm.
best? Trying to put myself into sort of like, you know, the lens of the fly. And it gets sort of tricky. But I think it's just thinking about, okay, what is the question you're trying to sort of answer, trying to sort of remove all your sort of like, as much as possible, your biases in what, you know, what you think the motivation of the animal is, you know, what you think the reasons for the animal to behave a certain way is, without, you know, evidence to support it. And, you know, yeah, it might be challenging, but I get there through conversations and making sure that, you know, there's someone who's like, it's like, how did you come to that sort of conclusion? Like, how did you, but yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, I don't know if anyone else has like ways to like, that helps them stay on track with, these behavioral experiments.
Yeah, I really like what Chad just said about sort of with talking to other people. I think it's really easy. And we get into, when we think about science a lot, we get into the like lone, usually old white dude scientist alone in the lab by themselves doing behavior experiments and saying, yes, the ants are having an alarm response. They look stressed. And it's really easy. And as an ant biologist who studies the alarm response, I definitely do have days where I'm like, oh my God, they look so panicked. Like, I don't know what to do. There's a lot going on, but through sort of communication with other people in the lab and really just talking to people who have diverse sets of experiences, we sort of can see like, oh, I'm coming to this, I'm bringing like my own personal experiences and biases and all of that to whatever scientific question I ask, to how I interpret the results. And like, I think that is part of the reason why sort of we need to think about who is doing science and who is not doing science. And are we sort of thinking about our biases? Because it's really easy to say, oh no, I'm a scientist, I must be objective. But when you sort of press on that a little bit more, you realize that I think I'm being objective because I'm me, but very much not objective. And it's important to have those conversations so you
I think I think you're also touching on, Lindsay, a little bit about like, not like who, and I know this is also coming at it from, obviously it's only humans studying other organisms. Other organisms are not studying humans, right? So it's like this completely biased system by nature of who who are the people doing this, which life form is doing the science, and that's us. It's like for the benefit of our own curiosities, I suppose, right? But like, I think also there's a lot of gatekeeping, just to go into a little bit of a tangent in the people doing science as opposed to just the social behavior research itself. It's interesting to think about the gatekeeping of knowledge and whose knowledge gets to be considered valid, especially when you have so many cultures and people who probably have a very intimate relationship with social organisms in their communities, in creative and different ways, right? Does that ever play into your work as social behavior scientists of like, who whose knowledge is considered valid in terms of how you think about moving forward with your experiments?
I don't know that it comes up that much in my personal experiments, but it's stuff that I read about and try to be aware of and try to go through those processes of like breaking apart, I guess, layers of bias. So I guess I can think of an example in social behavior, which is the study of like sexual behaviors and variation in sexual behaviors across individuals. And there's historically been like a kind of heteronormative paradigm where different sex interactions are seen as normal and same-sex interactions, sexual interactions, are seen as aberrant, or needing some kind of additional explanation, when that's kind of an example where scientists' biases have colored their interpretation of the data that they're picking up. And like more modern thinking in that line understands that probably some amount of same-sex interactions have always existed in animals, for example, because discrimination between sexes would be something that emerged after sexual behavior first evolved. Yeah, I don't know if anyone else has specific examples.
I think maybe like also something that ends up happening is maybe like ideas that we have about like how our specific society works and is built ends up getting applied to like social insects a lot. I think it's something you see, and like you can, and I don't know, like even in simple things, or like with like ant colonies, for example, like people expecting it to like maybe be like having like a queen and like having things that are like is going to be leading it, and then like you having to like kind of break down that idea and show that actually like it's not like command. Like I think that kind of maybe ends up like seeping a little bit into how we think about animal behavior, and especially when we're talking about social behavior. And then I think like really there's like really interesting things that can come from just like having different perspectives of like how a society can be organized, or things like that that can like actually bring like really good insight into like this field.
Yeah, I was
And
actually shocked to learn that the queen, I don't know, all of these like Disney movies and everything, it's like the queen is in charge. Or I watched the Ant arc of Hunter x Hunter. I don't know if anybody does anime out there. It's like the queen is like, this like evil villain that just wants to get all the energy to make, but I didn't realize that queen is just there for reproduction. Like that's what the queen does, right? Is that correct? Yeah. So it's like, yeah, I think it's really hard when we have these narratives that sort of describe animal societies in these human ways. And I'm also reminded of Taylor, I believe it was in your talk where you showed like the military and how it was this hierarchy, but then you showed the ants and it was like the circle. And or was that your, Lindsay? I don't remember. It was Taylor's. And it was like everything was like at least there was, everybody had a connection to everyone. And that was, I just thought, so interesting, and a cool way to think about societies, But can we ever be like that as humans? I don't know. I feel like we always default to hierarchy, even when we try to keep it like these flat structures, right? So
Yeah, I think there's some writing and thought that hierarchical social organizations are very common among primates, and that's the type of animal that we are. So it makes sense that we are inclined towards those types of organizations, and we tend to impose them on other organisms like social insects, just assuming if there's a society, it's got to be someone at the top giving all the instructions, when actually that's not how other organisms do organize their societies.
right.
I mean, we can recognize the problems that our hierarchical views have on us, but we also recognize that like ant colonies have lots of things happening in them that we would probably think are unethical, or not necessarily how we should decide to organize our own societies. Like, we should be careful what kind of lessons we draw from nature.
That is true. Especially when I think about like, well, I know this is a solitary, I think it's a solitary animal, but the praying mantis, how the female like decapitates the male after mating. I think that's probably not accepted in our society. So
you can find all kinds of cannibalism and infanticide and other types of murder happening in all societies, for sure.
Yeah. I just want to remind everybody who's in the audience, please feel free to, if you have a question, you're welcome to ask it over the microphone, or if you want to throw anything in the chat. We're here to engage if that's something that if you have a line of questioning that I am doing, if I'm not addressing it, or just have your, just want to chat, this is for you. Okay, so let's move on a little bit. And like, I'm just going to keep talking, everybody, but I will stop if you raise your hand. I just want to throw that out there. Another thing I learned is that generally solitary animals like worms and flies are demonstrating things that we consider as social behavior. So I'm just wondering, based on like what you all know about social behavior research, is some element of sociality an essential component of life? And I don't know if this is like philosophical or if there's like actual evidence to support it. So
I think,
Go ahead, Sophia.
oh, sorry. No, I was just gonna say, I think to some level, at least, like any animal that has sexual reproduction needs to be social at least in one moment of its life, because it needs to find like another animal to at the very least reproduce with. And then I think there's like gradations of things that you can see from like you just need like to interact with another animal to like reproduce, to like maybe like you need to interact with them to like like divide territory or somehow like forage or like, and I think there's also like different moments in which like maybe a solitary animal is almost never like social, but there are like specific situations that are very high stress, for example, or then it might be useful for, so I think there's like social and non-social is like a very like kind of like hard cutoff that we impose, but there are like I think moments in which even animals that we don't consider social like necessarily have to be social, or we see them being social. And like even in like insects, there's like the eusocial like insects, which are the insects that are like fit all the criteria for being social insects, but there are other insects that like fit like maybe one or two of the criteria, and like we wouldn't necessarily consider them like the most, so but they do still, so I think it's like maybe more of a gradation than necessarily dividing it as like social or non-social.
I made a little slide about this.
you like to share it?
Sure.
Okay.
I need
Hold on. Let me give you some permission here. Okay.
Cool. Yeah. So I totally agree with what Sophia was saying, that sociality is more like a gradation than it is like a hard cutoff. And there's some types of social interactions that are really common, like like mating, courtship are required for everything that's sexual pretty much, and that's most animals, for example. But there's also other circumstances where organisms share a common danger, and they might, even if they don't spend a lot of their time, in close contact, if there's a common danger, then it can be helpful for one to warn the other in the hope that they might also be warned in the future. And you have, as organisms' interests become more aligned with each other, then you can start to see more and more tight knitting of social groups. And that's why you start to see other things like group foraging or sharing resources are also pretty common. And you have organisms that live together and they share a nest because they can work together to make a better nest than they could on their own. And in the most social types of organisms, you have things like division of labor, where you have one individual that's doing one type of task and a different individual that's doing a different type of task. And we usually consider the most social to be those where there's like a strict division between types in terms of how much they can reproduce. And that's what you see in the most advanced, we call them types of ants, where you have workers that can't lay any eggs at all, and only the queen can lay eggs. And the word for use for that type of social organization is sometimes called a superorganism, because those workers really can't they can help, but they can't ever reproduce on their own. So they're kind of like required to stay as part of the nest if they're gonna, if their family group is gonna succeed at all. And I just put some examples of like different sorts of organisms and where they might fall, with humans maybe being somewhere in the middle, because humans can live on their own if they want to, but we certainly see most humans living in groups and doing lots of things like living together, sharing resources, and communicating all sorts of other types of information. So sorry for that little tangent.
I love it. It's like the perfect representation of the graduate student who's ready to go, so it's awesome. So I can't help but ask about, like, okay, we're talking about things that are multicellular, that are, fairly complex along the lines of evolution, as insects or worms. But what about like when you were talking about superorganism, Taylor, all I could think about was like a biofilm, or not all I could think about, but one of the things that came to my mind was biofilm, which is bacteria. Is something like that considered social, or is that more just functional?
Absolutely. Yeah, so there's all sorts of social microbes. So social living is probably goes all the way back to bacteria. And so single-celled organisms sometimes work together to create a nice environment for themselves to live in by secreting chemicals that are going to protect them, or help them collect nutrients or kill off predators or something like that. And also, multicellular organisms are cells cooperating with one another, right? Because we're just a bunch of cells, and
that's
those
very
cells
meta.
have they can't live on their own anymore. They form this complex organism, and yeah, that's exactly the line of thinking that the social evolutionary biologists like to draw parallels between, like, the types of organization between cells and the types of organization between organisms have a lot in common.
That's very cool. We just learned yesterday about how plant cells are like you can have a leaf, which is made up of all of these different cells, and the cytoplasm, which is the aqueous part of the stuff inside of the cell, is continuous from cell to cell through these little tiny channels called plasmodesmata. It was sort of, I think we learned this in like 11th grade biology class, but we relearned about it yesterday for one of the educational programs that we have for Lab Jumpstart. It's kind of awesome to think about it in terms of cells too. I love that that analogy and that science. I actually also want to learn a little bit about, it was interesting to me that you all chose papers where you knew of one of the authors on the paper. How tight is the social behavioral science community? Like, do you all like know each other, and so are you in fact social as social behavior scientists?
I mean, I think it depends, and because largely, like, you sort of know people that are sort of in your field studying similar things to you, quite adjacent to you. So you're familiar with those labs, and you're familiar with their papers, some of their papers. And of course, if you have done collaborations with them. For me, when choosing my paper, like I went to another member of my lab, and I started talking about social behavior, and we were talking about, okay, I talked about like this D4P, and I was like, what's like a good, sort of like thing to talk about. And we sort of landed on this, and we both thought, oh, this is a cool idea, this is a cool concept, something, that we're not currently doing, but it would be something fun to talk about. And he knew of this author because he's during his undergrad. And I was like, cool. And I followed him on Twitter, and he followed me back. And
You're
and
Twitter famous.
yeah. And now it's great. And I think, before like that, I wouldn't have, like, he wouldn't have been on my radar unless like I've like, sort of like reached out. And then now I'm like seeing his science posts and be able to keep, I think he works on ants now. So yeah, so he's not even working with flies now. So he's moved on to ants. But yeah, I think, yeah, it's definitely, I mean, we could be more, I guess, there could be more communication, but there's definitely communication between like different groups, depending on like what you're studying and your field, and who you're collaborating with.
Cool.
This might be getting us a bit off topic, but I really like that Chad brought up Twitter, because I feel like Twitter is how I learn about a lot of the cool science happening at other places at this point. And I think it's especially cool because, of course, depending on who you follow, you sort of get to follow the science of people who might not necessarily be coming to give lectures at Rockefeller or be friends with people who know people, I think. And that's sort of one avenue of kind of bridging, because it's great that science, the community can be very small, but at the same time, it's sort of, there's a lot of like, oh yeah, I know this person, so we should hire them, or we should bring them in to give a lecture. And I think it's really important for us to think about how our own biases shape who is being brought in, or how the people in power's biases shape that. And I think there's a lot to be said about science Twitter, but I do appreciate that you can sort of build a community of people who are doing really, really cool things, who you might not have gotten to know through the like more traditional networking.
Right. It feels like Twitter is a great equalizer. So just for everybody in the audience, Twitter is a very popular communication platform for sharing science. People like to tweet out their scientific research in the form of their papers. It helps with spreading the paper around and getting more sort of views on your paper. It's just like a way to promote your research. So it's a really cool way to see what's coming down the pipelines for lots of different types of research. So I highly recommend, if you're interested in connecting with scientists who want to talk about their work, they're always eager to talk about their work. I would recommend going onto Twitter for that. So just as an FYI. And everybody here is definitely a Twitter user. We have tweeted it out for each other, which is kind of fun. Speaking of which, maybe this is a bit of a tangent, but I love where this is going. And I know it's really difficult to think about your model organisms as models for human behavior. So I'm not trying to suggest that, but we could maybe like as a communication modality, would you consider in the human, species, would you consider like digital communication as a unique form of communication for sociality? Or is it like written or visual, or like, is there something inherently different? And I know this might be opinion since you're not human social behaviorists. Yeah.
I don't.
Oh,
Sorry,
go ahead.
go ahead. Chad, you can start, because I was gonna say I'm not really sure, but so go ahead.
Well, I am also not really sure. But I mean, I think for me, it sounds like it's a combination of like the sort of modalities we already know already, like, so I think there's a lot of visual communication on social media. And I think there's also sort of auditory communication. So I think I'm not sure. I mean, maybe it's a category of itself, but it seems like if it's its category of itself, it's made up of like the different forms or different ways we actually communicate. I more see it like as a medium by which
Sure.
we should communicate. So yeah, I think that's my answer.
I think the question speaks to the flexibility that you sometimes see in communication, that humans are really, really good at coming up with new ways to communicate with each other. Like, spoken language came first. Later, we invented writing. We've invented Braille, so we can communicate through touching things. And now we have like all these different ways to send signals to each other. And so that sort of reminds me of like, where do you see flexibility in areas in nature in terms of communication? And it's maybe not, I think maybe humans have the most advanced kind of flexibility in communication, but you do see other things like in ant colonies, the ants can recognize members of their own nest based on their smell. And the smell of the nest is something that changes over time, and it changes with the environment. So it's not genetically encoded necessarily. It's something that the ant is learning what the nest smells like. And they have some flexibility there, because they can, even if the nest is like gets a new smell to it, they can still keep track of who's a member and who's not.
One thing humans don't have, however, and this is what I learned from you all, is pheromones. I was shocked to learn that humans do not have pheromones. That was wild because I've always heard these old wives' tale of like young women in dorm rooms syncing up on their menstrual cycles because the pheromones, right? And all of these things. So yeah, so thank you for that, by the way. So we do have some questions coming in, and please, if you do have more questions, feel free to unmute or just drop something in the chat. I love this one from Clinton. Being a researcher for social behavior, how does this affect, or how does this knowledge affect the way you see society at the moment? Like, do you find yourself like at the supermarket studying, finding yourself being like, oh, I'm taking extra observations. This is interesting behavior, or it doesn't have to be the supermarket.
I guess like you really don't know how things work until you really study them. So it takes a lot of work to figure out how an ant colony is passing information to one another or any other species, and humans are no different. So I think we need to pay attention to the people who are studying human social behavior, who are people studying media and sociology and history and all these other disciplines, who are trying to understand how human societies work. So like pay attention to the real experts on those sorts of questions.
I think that's a solid answer. Thank you. And we have another one from Jessica about learned behavior. So do any of the species that, and I think we do, we've seen some learned behavior, and maybe, I don't know, Chad, do you want to sort of talk a little bit about the paper that you presented?
Yeah, so in the paper with the fly with flies, how they sort of warn, or they get to transmit information about a predator that's around, they surmise that it's through learning. So visual, and it's gated visually. So you have a fly that's been exposed to wasp, then interacting with a naive fly that hasn't been exposed to wasp, and it receives some sort of visual input, and then it learns to suppress its egg laying as a result. And they've done these experiments where they saw that this learning doesn't happen outside of this visual input. So they excluded all these other senses, and they stuck on vision, and specifically they stuck to the wings. The wings carried some sort of like important visual behavior that allowed this transfer of information. And learning in flies doesn't just stay to this sort of behavior. There's actually like olfactory learning. There's different ways flies could like learn specific behavior. A fly could learn, they could associate. There's associative learning where a fly could associate an odor that was once neutral, that they didn't care about, as something now positive, or they could consider it as something negative. So there's ways in which flies could learn depending on like their experience at any given point in time, which is also pretty cool. As an experiment, like I get to like look at their neurons and like manipulate their neurons, and sort of like you sort of feel like you're like doing brain control, but be able to sort of manipulate the way the animals learn, or the way they associated different stimuli, and how they interact with their environment.
Yeah, how much neuroscience is incorporated into all of your work? So this is separate from the papers that you presented. Since you're all social behaviorists, do you also find yourself identifying as neuroscientists?
Yeah, I think because largely, so this is just for me, because I've had conversations with my friends, and they would be like, well, you're a biologist, and I'd be like, well, I don't know if I'm a neuroscientist. I don't know if I'd be, because for me, like a biologist, like they it's much more of a broader field, and I feel like I'm just more like specialized to neuroscience. Like I don't have like a background in biology. I do have one in chemistry, and I transferred to neuroscience. So in that respect, I feel like, okay, well, I'm a neuroscientist, but not quite about. I mean, I guess, and this is just like my opinion on things. But it factors in. I think neuroscience is one of those fields that it encompasses a lot of other sort of like fields. Like, I find myself having to learn coding and engineering and all these different things while I'm engaging in the study of the brain. And it's one of the wonderful things about neuroscience, right?
Yeah, I'd definitely say I would probably be more likely to call myself a neuroscientist than say that I am a social behaviorologist or whatever. I don't even know what the terminology is exactly.
Me neither. I made it up.
I think just because I'm really interested in behavior, because I want to know, I'm really interested in how the brain regulates and makes behavior happen. And that's sort of the approach that I've taken to a lot of, or sort of the reason why I've gotten into studying the brain. I think that being said, not every neuroscientist cares about behavior, and not everyone who does behavior cares about the brain. And I think it's really cool that we have people coming in with these different approaches to studying the brain, and we learn a lot from being able to sit in a room with people who all have different like scientific backgrounds and maybe approach questions slightly differently.
Yeah. So Chad, you were mentioning your contraption that you were building all this time. And Sophia, I know your lab does a ton of like math and physics and coding and building of contraptions. And then I was actually, one of the things that I learned about your lab, so Taylor and Lindsay are in the same lab, is how different your projects are from one another. And it's just like, I don't know, it's really cool to see the different ways that you are all approaching it. And when you see each, do you feel that you are sort of even like sub specialties based on sort of your little corner of science? Like, do you feel that the work that you do is a little bit like hyper specialized?
I say to some extent, yes. I mean, even, within the lab. So, it's like within my own lab, I feel like I have this like specific, area of interest that no one else is really studying, that, I'm sort of like an expert in. And I feel, well, let me use expert in quotes. I'm still learning very much a lot. And it almost, but even though like, I would say that even though it's like it's still sort of like open, even though it's like very niche, it's still like, there's still like a lot overlap in which you could like, use what to sort of gain insight on something else, like, provide perspective to sort of like another project or like another interest. We find ways to collaborate with each other. Sophia might find something interesting. She also worked with flies that, that might be insightful for something I'm doing, or vice versa. And then we might find room to sort of collaborate on that, and then, gain new insight overall, putting both our sort of specialities together to like really uncover something fascinating about fly behavior and the way neurons communicate with each other.
Yeah, I think like one interesting thing that at least I found like is that like you can at the same time be doing something very multidisciplinary and also like really specialized. So you can be doing something that requires you knowing like how to code and how to like cut something on a table saw and how to like solder wires and how to like cross flies to do something. Like you kind of need like skills in a bunch of like different fields, but then like inside your lab, often you're kind of like hyper focused on this thing and you're like surrounded by people that are also like really, and it just seems like this one specific question is like the most interesting thing in the world. And like, I think that's like Chad said, like one of the great advantages of like collaborating with different people and like talking to different people in different fields and in different organisms, and like being in a university where like we have like Taylor and Lindsay's lab like right next to us, and we have Chad like a few floors down. It's kind of like being able to talk to people like that and having them like kind of break you out of your little corner where you're just like very absorbed in this one thing. And I think that often the best insights come from that. Like you're just kind of like hyper focused on like thinking about it that one specific way, and then someone new comes in and is like, oh, have you thought about this? And I feel like that's often like the most interesting things that you can find come like that.
Cool. And I'm going to sort of paraphrase a little bit of Megan's question, who wanted to know about favorite pieces of things, right? So since you didn't do none of you did the experiments that, just to clarify, everybody presented on research. So I just want to give a shout out to Ms. Hunt's class. I know that you are all here, and I know that you're on a school computer and can't turn on your mic. So thank you for dropping those questions in the chat. And I know you didn't get an opportunity to attend the previous session. So just as an FYI, our presenters talked about a paper of that described research, but they didn't do the research themselves. So I'm just going to paraphrase your question, Megan, and ask everybody to share what their favorite part of each paper was. What was sort of like the coolest piece that you took away from the paper that you presented for the Data for the People series? Take your time thinking about it, because I think it's everybody's like, I
Favorites
don't
are
know.
always hard.
Yeah.
Favorites are really hard. I really liked the experiment. So in the paper that I talked about, which I also got to see some of that research when it was being done, because it was done by other people in the lab that I work in. They studied how ants give the signal that there's food basically to other ants. And they found that there is so one ant will find a piece of food and then go back to the nest, and then suddenly all the other ants in the nest leave and go straight to the food. And so the researchers did an experiment to test what type of signal might be used to tell the other ants to leave. And they found that it's an attractive signal that passes through, it can go through like a filter, basically. Filter is the wrong word. It goes through a mesh. It's something that goes through a mesh. So it doesn't require contact. And based on how fast it happens, it's probably a smell. It's probably a pheromone that the ant releases that the other ants smell, and then it triggers them to go get the food. And it's just a nice set of experiments to learn something cool. Like, I don't think anyone really knew that there was specifically recruitment pheromone is what they call it, used in this specific context.
I think my favorite part of the paper that I talked about, so I talked about a paper that described how a species, actually the same species of ants that Taylor just mentioned, the Flannel Raider ant, deals with when one ant in their colony gets sick, and do they sort of isolate that individual or do they groom that individual more? And I thought it was really, really clever and creative. So the authors had to find a way to make the ants sick without having them be sick in a way that they would give every other ant in the colony that sickness. And I thought it was really clever and creative. They essentially gave like an ant vaccine, so something that activated the immune system of the ants without actually making the ants like contagiously sick. And I thought that was really clever. And I'm also excited to see how that sort of approach can be used in other studies of sickness in ants.
I guess I talked about a paper where I have like these like little roundworms, and they're kind of swarming together to eat all like bacteria that they use as food. And I guess the coolest part that I thought about the paper that I talked about is that you have these like videos where you just see all the worms kind of swarming together, and you can kind of see roughly what the behavior is like, but you can't really tell what any worm is doing. And then they make this like kind of really cool worms that have like a part of their mouth that just glows, and then they can like look at each individual and see what they're doing. And that's just like, I thought was a pretty cool trick where like you can make like each individual glow, and then you can see like what each of them are doing.
I think my favorite part of the paper, and it's more like, you know, what it left me wanting more. And it's the idea. So this is a paper where ants that was exposed to wasp, you know, they lay less eggs, and they teach naive flies, and then they in turn to lay less eggs. What was fascinating to me was that these flies that were taught to lay less eggs can't teach other flies. So the learning stops there. And in my mind, I'm like, why? Why would the learning stop there? Of course, like you think about sort of like, you know, a reason why it's beneficial. Like you don't want like this sort of behavior to propagate to all everywhere, and then all flies stop laying as many eggs, and you could see how that becomes a problem. But you know, it's like, what is the sort of mechanism? And I began thinking about it's like what about, you know, being exposed directly is different for the fly that saw the wasp to, you know, not just having learned it from someone who's being exposed. You know, it's like, are the flies that were taught, are they just like hush hush? It's like, you know, let's not tell I don't know. You know, it's like, it's just bubbling in my mind. It's like, okay, what is behind that? Like what is the difference there biologically?